So a little while ago, we wrote a blog post on introducing the event gateway. Before we define what an event gateway is, why did you feel the need to define this category? What was it that you had seen and the conversations you'd had that led you to believe that there was this product category called the event gateway?
I wish I could say it was kind of grand master plan with a strong vision from the get-go, but what really happened is we started building Hookdeck as this kind of webhook ingestion infrastructure. And throughout the years, just by the cleverness of the users, I guess, they kind of made it painfully obvious to us that Hookdeck maybe wasn't just meant to receive webhooks. And when we looked into all the use cases of the users and what they were building on top of Hookdeck, actually, in hindsight, it feels like we probably should have noticed that earlier. The common denominator was much more around the event-driven nature of their use case rather than like webhooks specifically. So we had people, for instance, like receiving IoT devices events on Hookdeck, or sending events from SDKs and libraries, or people sending webhooks. And then there was all the blurry lines in between those clear-cut use cases of just non-traditional event-driven use cases that didn't clearly fit the webhook model. So through that, what we really notice is that the thing people are struggling with is the interoperability of those events. So receiving events from third parties or sending events to those third parties. I think it took us a while to coin it and really be able to put a word to that. But I think Event Gateway really segments those two things well. So the event for the event-driven nature of the problem, and then the gateway because of the interoperability with a third party. So it was really not our own doing. I'm going to give most of the credit to all the developers on Hookdeck that built things outside of what we had described in our docs. And I think in many ways, listening to them is really how it brought about the term. I think the idea itself was naturally born out of it.
When you think of a gateway, you think of this fundamental piece that's guarding and that acts as a boundary and barrier to all these services that you're either offering or to the services that you're trying to connect to. In retrospect, like Alex said, this is really what we were building, but we never really put it into words. But it's funny, he said we should have thought about it earlier, I think, because it really was what we were building all along without really realizing it and without being conscious about it. But users started using us in those different ways where they wanted to be able to have a uniform way of authenticating, having a uniform way of dealing with signatures, and having this unified interface of receiving and sending events. And that's where I think it came from. And there was an inspiration also, I think, with the API gateway, which was obviously a pretty big product category over the years. And there are definitely parallels. I think there are parallels, but I think there's also, of course, fundamental differences because you don't treat asynchronous the same way that you treat synchronous in the case of an API. So there's definitely an overlap, but there's also fundamental differences.
I remember one specific week where I think we got somewhere in between like 15 to 20 different people asking to add custom domains, like white label the endpoints where they would receive their webhooks. And we had done it before on an ad hoc basis and setting custom CNAMEs for those folks. But when there were so many, it was just like, why do you care what the URL is, right? You're giving it to Stripe or GitHub or Shopify. And that was originally how we were thinking about it. But then we realized that people were giving those endpoints to their users or to their customers, or they were embedding it in their SDKs. And now suddenly it does matter what the endpoint is going to be. And I think the circumstance of that specific week, I just remember it as a moment of clarity of, wait a minute, this is not a product specifically for webhooks. And they're telling me by the dozen right now, and I probably should be listening. And the next thing we did is we built the actual custom domain in product. And then when we released it, we removed any price tag on it. And then we just got absolutely flooded with people adding their URLs. So I think moments like this are just like moments of clarity in what you're trying to build. And we just paid attention to it.
Did you really have a vision that there was more than inbound, being this interface between external and your internal services? Or did you have a mindset of there may be more to this, and if we make it generic enough and unopinionated, which is a word I've heard you both use when you describe Hookdeck, that it will make it possible for our users, the developers on the platform, to discover use cases that we haven't thought of?
Yeah, we always knew. I should pull up a slide from a presentation I did to the team, I want to say in 2021. And on that specific slide, there's what is Hookdeck right now? And there's this little corner of the quadrant. And then there's Hookdeck in 3 years and then Hookdeck in 10 years. I think we always knew that the underlying event-driven architecture problems were big. And I think we knew that we accidentally almost fixed some really important issues with event-driven architectures, especially at that time we were thinking a lot about our issue system and how that was very innovative versus the dead letter queue paradigm right now. So we knew, but I think the part that we hadn't fully put together or coined at that time was the interoperability part. I think we were thinking of Hookdeck more as a general purpose queue over time. And I think what we realize is the real challenge is the gateway part. It's not necessarily like the queuing part. So it definitely evolved through this. We didn't have the right words for it, but I think also through those customer experiences, what we had envisioned at 2021 is really not where we're at now. But that's fine. That's part of the startup discovery process. But I think the intention was always there that the webhook ingestion wasn't going to be the end in the story.
I remember that slide like it was yesterday. And there was one thing at the time, Alex having this vision, but also us talking about it. Alex was saying we had defined Hookdeck as addressing 4 different scenarios, and it was first party to first party to third party to first party, and third party, right? And the market that we were serving at the time was third party to first party. So you have a provider such as Stripe or Shopify or whatever that's sending you webhooks, and you want to protect your infrastructure against spikes and things like that. And that's kind of what we did. That was the intention behind Hookdeck initially. But Alex has this grander vision of, first party, and all these other ones. And I had internalized it, I think, but I hadn't seen the use cases behind it, or how customers would use it. I knew the theory, but I hadn't seen the practice yet, so it didn't click and it didn't fall in place for me until we actually started seeing it. So we started seeing customers using Hookdeck to basically protect their infrastructure from themselves, or interoperability-wise, being able to have this unified interface of being able to send and receive. And we also started seeing some first party to third party. And when we introduced transformations, we started seeing some third party to third party. So that's when the pieces came together for me.
What's really interesting there is the positioning of the website was very much inbound webhooks, right? No, never miss a webhook. Yet even with that positioning, you're finding people trying to use you in different ways, which is saying our intent is for you to do this, and yet they're still finding different ways of using the product.
And I think ultimately that was clear as day. What better of a sign could you ask for, right? That makes it painfully clear that what you're putting in your docs should probably be different. And the way that you're talking about the product should also probably be different, right? So I think that's actually the number one factor that made us very confident in doing this change. The other thing too that I want to speak about, and I think that's like more a communication thing than specifically a technical or a product question. But it's also clear that most like sophisticated engineers that we were talking about, they didn't equate webhooks to difficulty in their mind. They equate events and difficult in their mind. So whenever we talked about webhook, we unintentionally led the discussion toward a HTTP post complexity conversation, which is really not that complicated, right? Like, let's be real. You're receiving your webhooks HTTP post request. Like, everyone feels fairly confident about that. The difficulty is more the event-driven processing of that request when it has actually come in and you've received that HTTP request. So we realized that like the conversations that we were having weren't invoking to mind painful experiences of those developers in the past or those engineers in the past. And those experiences that they have or do you remember is like the time that they fought with RabbitMQ and was going haywire and they had no idea how to fix it and trying to recover from like major production issues in their event-driven architectures and so on. They weren't thinking about the day that the HTTP post didn't work. I think like throughout this conversation, it's clear that technically we're still talking about the same thing. We're talking about a webhook, we're talking about event, but we're putting the focus on the part that people associate with being difficult. Hindsight, it seems obvious now, but at the time, it felt like the more specific we named the problem, the more clear the messaging was going to be and the value proposition. But it turns out it's really not the case. And I think that was an interesting learning for us on how we talk about the product.
I think that's really interesting too, because if you think about it, really, a webhook is just a transport layer or transport mechanism to get an event into your architecture, into your infrastructure, transport it out of your infrastructure. The problems start happening when you're dealing with volume, when you're dealing with scale, when you stop receiving those events specifically. So let's say that you're running a successful store and you stop at some point receiving those events because of whatever reason. Now you have to go through all the motions of resyncing with the provider and using the provider's API and doing data exports and all that stuff, which is a huge time sink. Then in the future, obviously, to guard yourself against that, you're going to put a queue in place and you're going to build essentially what we built, which is Hookdeck, to safeguard against those problems happening in the future. But by the same token, if you're talking about any kind of generic event, not necessarily a webhook, when you're really receiving a low amount or a little amount of those, recovering is pretty easy. But when you're starting to receive a higher volume of those, that's when, again, you get into trouble. So that's where the whole holistic thing makes sense. And really, webhooks is a means to an end of solving that problem, if you will. And we're more and more dependent on events, because one of the things I had written in one of the original articles I wrote for Hookdeck that holds even more true today is that you look at the SaaS world today, everybody is specializing. Like you're seeing very, very narrow and very, very well-defined verticals as opposed to a product that does everything. And integration is king. Integration is key between these different platforms. So events are not going to go away anytime soon. And providing that mechanism to be able to glue all of this together is where I think Hookdeck's strength.
To close off the loop on the HTTP, like there's nothing inherently wrong with it as a protocol. I think the issue has a lot more to do with tooling infrastructure than protocol specifics. But I think that's interesting when you think about like us building on top of a bunch of different providers or service providers that are in those narrow vertical that Maurice was talking about. Ultimately, what you realize is that we're building event-driven architectures, but as two different classes. There's kind of your internal that has great tooling. You're using Kafka, you're using SQS or like whatever. There's good kind of like industry standard tools there, and there's people building more approaches to that. There's like the ingest and the trigger.dev and the temporal and so on that are building good asynchronous business logic. But then there's this second class, which is, let's call it the renegade of like some guy at Twilio one day was like, oh, we need to like send an event to this other server. Let's call it a webhook, and came up with some generalized way of doing this that isn't really a standard, right? And now people are building like mission critical applications all day long, receiving hundreds of millions of those webhooks in a way that doesn't have nearly as much robustness as the things that we're building within our own infrastructure, right? And that robustness is kind of essential because we're moving from a world of transactional consistency where you were doing everything inside your own applications. You could rely on a database or some ASIC compliant storage. You would run your transaction there. You knew you had integrity and so on. So now you're receiving the stream of HTTP requests you have no control over, wishing for the best that you're going to have integrity from that. So what that means is that we're moving to this event-driven, but also eventually consistent world, which is a great thing because it's good for interoperability, it's good for scalability, it's good for building independent pieces. But we also have no tooling around it. And so the likelihood of that breaking or kind of feeling very disparate from the rest of your infrastructure is very, very high. So I think in many ways, like the vision for Hookdeck is to try to like bridge the gap there, where you can think of the events that are interoperable with other platform or leaving your infrastructure the same way that you can think about the ones that are within your infrastructure, and that they execute with the same level of guarantees and the same level of robustness as what we've already kind of come to expect when it's like within our own infrastructure. So ideally, there's this kind of like event data plane that is true for the whole cloud and all the providers on the cloud, where it doesn't matter if this event is going to your internal infrastructure or it's going to your external infrastructure. You have the same set of expectations and control over it, right? Which is a far cry from the world that we're in now. And I remember on this slide from 2021 that you're talking about, there's this concept in there which I hadn't defined that I called like the internet event mesh or something like that. And I remember just like putting it in there and there's like a question mark. It's like, what is this even supposed to mean, right? And I think as time goes on, this is getting more and more concrete in terms of what we mean by that. Or maybe I'd kind of like internalized but not really put words to. But I think the need for an event gateway really comes from that.
So anyway, Jeff Lindsay has a lot to answer for, that guy at Twilio, and I guess to be thankful for. So question number 2 is, we've answered probably quite a bit of this throughout the previous question, but is there a very clear definition of what an event gateway is, either through the use cases it solves or the capability it provides or the features it provides? How would you define the event gateway as a product category, I should say? And this isn't just Hookdeck.
The event gateway is the evolution of what an API gateway has been to synchronous workflow for asynchronous workflow. So what that means is that the value proposition that you're sharing is very similar. So you're talking about security, you're talking about throughput control, you're talking about routing, you're talking about rule-based transformations, filterings, and so on. But I think the major difference is that an event gateway is persistent, it's stateful. So that means it's also a queue in a way that the API gateway really isn't. What that enables, what that state enables, is now to decouple the request coming in to the request being processed. So when we talk about throughput control, for instance, in a API gateway context, we're thinking about rate limiting. And after a certain amount of throughput, you're going to return a 429 and start denying the request. In a event gateway model, all requests are accepted, and it's the speed at which those are consumed that now becomes the variable that you control, right? So in the case of Hookdeck, we work as a HTTP push queue. So that means Hookdeck acts as a full replacement for whatever stateful kind of workload that you would run, like your SQS or your RabbitMQ and so on. But all those value propositions carry over from the API gateway to the event gateway, but are implemented in a way that are different. So like the security mechanisms that you're going to use are not going to be the same ones. And when you talk about, for instance, like filtering, it's very different in the context of a event gateway, because what the event gateway lets you do is to fan out or fan in those requests, where you can take a single request and transform it into multiple. And that's the beauty of decoupling the source, like the original request, from the response. So since it's no longer a one-to-one relationship of the request that came in and the response, that means now the response could never come. It could come hours later. It could be to multiple different destinations and so on. So to me, the event gateway is really this interoperability between whatever the outside world and data that comes in and the subsystems or the other dependent systems that need to process that event data. So it's the guarantees, it's the integrity, it's the uptime, and it's this visibility into those events.
It's quite a definition. Okay, Alex, can you give us a quick overview of the use cases that you see an event gateway solving? So rather than the features that you've covered, kind of capabilities you've covered there, what are the use cases?
Yeah, so there's kind of 4 broad use cases, and I think the thing that's important to understand is that the real individual use cases of customers are somewhere in between, right? So we put those use cases as kind of like guides. But the reality is, based on the different use cases, like the lines get blurry between all of those. But those 4 main ones that we've identified. The first one is the inbound webhooks. So the inbound webhooks is how we used to think about Hookdeck. It's all the data that's coming from those different providers. They have the usual suspects characteristic of webhooks. So the signatures, and they're coming from a third party you don't control, and so on. And then it's going to your own servers to be processed. So that's going to be your own application logic, whether that's some workloads running in EC2 or Roku or Vercel or like you name it, as long as you're the one building the application logic. Then the second use case is the opposite of that, which is the outbound webhook. So it's you yourself as a platform. You're now a producer, you're an emitter of event, and you're sending those events to your customers or other platforms or even public event streams that you're publishing and so on. And then in that case, you're the one that controls the throughput, you're the one that controls the data, but you don't control any of the responses or the downstream destination or endpoints or where that's going to go. The third one is what we call connecting services together. So that tends to be webhooks that are coming from third parties. So that might be your Shopify, your GitHub, and so on, but then going to another platform where you also don't control the business logic. And usually in those scenarios, you'll want to do things like transformations and filtering because you want to shape the data from one system to another. The fourth one is what we're calling the asynchronous API. The asynchronous API is when you want to be able to receive events, but from your customers or from devices or from libraries and so on. And in those scenarios, you need the ability to receive those events and have a specific characteristic around those events and then process it with your own application logic or send it to a third party. So those are really the main four pillars, but usually what we see, like I said, is those line blurs. So you have one customer that receives a webhook from Shopify, sends it to their application to run their own business logic, but then also sends it to a third party like marketing service, right? In which case now suddenly they have two use cases kind of in one, like for the same webhook that they receive. And really the spectrum is really wide of what people end up building or doing with it.
In the first section, we talked about first party to first party, but you didn't cover it there. Is there a reason that we feel that an event gateway potentially doesn't deliver the same sort of value for that use case?
I think we do, because the first party to first party, I think only really makes sense in serverless context. It's much more competitive on the first party to first party kind of serverless context. And it's very unclear to this day what is the best way of building asynchronous applications in that context. And I think the thing that I have difficulty with when it comes to this is that you're getting closer to business logic. And I think in that sense, you're getting a lot more competitive with what, for instance, like Ingest or QStash and so on are doing. And while I think Hookdeck totally works in that scenario and is a great product, and a lot of people are building great product in that category, I don't know if we're at a place where we can say, listen, Hookdeck will be the best solution for this, and we want to put our stake in the ground for it, right? I think it's very unclear how that is going to evolve at this point. I think there's various different solutions, and they're all kind of competitive. But I think we have a much more unique value proposition when it comes to the interoperability with the third party.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where people also end up using us on first to first right now because they have familiarity with Hookdeck from other use cases. So they end up using the platform for first to first because they know how to use it and they know how to do it. So there's no barrier to introducing Hookdeck as a first to first and within their own infrastructure. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it in the context of when the boundaries are well defined between your services. So when you have isolated pieces of infrastructure because you're dealing with whatever application, but you're dealing with something that is more public and something that is more private, and you need to kind of exchange information in between, or you need to do a round robin of processing and you need some rate limiting, but you don't want to implement it internally. So that's, I think, where it makes sense.
The other thing too is like you refer to this like first party to first party that we added in kind of like, you know, this 2021 vision. And I think one of the biggest thing that changed in between those years is that we used to be super bullish on first to first. And now I think we moved to not even wanting to do first to first at all. And that's probably like the single biggest change, because when you think about it, we were talking about third party, first party, third party to third party, which is all things that we do now, right? And third party to first party has this asynchronous use case and the inbound webhook kind of baked into third party to first party. That's like a nuance of third party to first party. So the one that we really aren't talking about anymore is the first party to first party, which is kind of ironic because it's the one that I was the most bullish on. But I think that's the strongest point of realization that we've had, which is the place where we can add the most value is when a third party is involved.
For a product category to be established, and it's not that we're expecting Gartner to adopt this idea of an event gateway, but there also needs to be competitors. There needs to be other people building similar things or other solutions that you can pull together to kind of go, when those are combined, that is an event gateway. So what are those other solutions out there that you feel fit into that category of an event gateway?
Yeah, so when we think about other event gateways, we think of the EventBridge of this world. Ultimately, there's probably only like 4 real product that you could put in there. So those are basically the big product category for each one of the big clouds, right? So you're going to have Google Cloud Event Arc, you're going to have AWS EventBridge, and remind me what the name of the Azure one is.
Event Grid.
Event Grid, that's right. So we usually think of those as event gateways product. And when it comes to like the Gartners and so on, I think the point is not to make it a new category, is to give that category a name. Because up until now, how would you have classified EventBridge? I'm not sure AWS really even knows. If you go and read on their website, there's no clear category for that.
Gartner have them in Enterprise Service Bus.
Sure, but then does that feel like a fair description? Like a fair descriptive category for what it is? I don't think it does.
It was a big bucket that they could throw it in, I think. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a catch-all. That's really what it is.
Yeah.
And I think it's a big enough segment, it's a big enough problem that it will grow out of this catch-all category into its own. Ultimately, I think we're trying to establish the kind of like the terminology and the way of thinking about it.
It's interesting that you didn't say Kafka. There's 2 reasons. Firstly, I think a lot of people, when you think of event-driven architecture, Kafka is so well known, they'll go, okay, well, we'll put Kafka in the middle of this. Secondly, we're just about to publish this comparison of event gateway solutions. And Kafka, when you look at the comparison in terms of what it has, it actually does very well in comparison to Hookdeck, which is an event gateway. It's a complex tool, but it allows you to bring in the other tools from this ecosystem to enable the interoperability with other systems. So be interested to get your thoughts on how you think Kafka fits into this product category of an event gateway.
I think Kafka is ultimately kind of like a substitute in the sense that it's a dominant kind of like event bus or event streaming system. But you can't actually just use Kafka. Like Kafka is just one part of kind of a multi-part system. And ultimately, all the event gateways are also built on top of a event bus or event stream. So in the case of Hookdeck, it's built on top of Kafka, right? So the point is Kafka is underlying technology, and then the event gateway makes use of that to enable developers to solve specific challenges or product experiences. And historically, people have basically gone around and built their own capabilities on top of Kafka to be able to do something like this. So I think of Kafka akin to like MySQL or Postgres is to like PlanetScale or Neon or all those serverless database offering, right? In the sense that, yes, you're building on top of those core fundamentals, but then when you're layering on its own set of functionalities and developer experience and so on, that then enables you to solve more specific problems. So I don't think Kafka is going anywhere, but I think there's going to be more layers of abstraction to solve more specific problems that are built on top of it. And all the event gateways would be an example of that.
It's interesting that you went there for that comparison, because I see things a little bit differently in the sense that, like Alex said, Kafka is an event streaming platform, right? And that's what it's optimized for. And I think when you're talking about the ecosystem, you're referring to things like all the Kafka streams or Kafka Connect applications that you can use, and you can kind of integrate services together where you have sources and sinks and you can get data into Kafka and data out of Kafka. But there is one fundamental thing to keep in mind, is that platform and that way of operating is optimized for speed and throughput. And what I mean by this is that once you get something into Kafka, you want to get it out as quickly as you can, and you want to read it as quickly as you can. And there is no concept of things like dead lettering, for instance. So things like Kafka connectors or Kafka applications do implement dead lettering. But Kafka itself does not offer a dead lettering primitive in the way that, let's say, a Google PubSub or something like that does, or in the way that Hookdeck offers you granularity on retry mechanisms. The way that Kafka works is by batches, and if one message within that batch fails, the whole batch fails. So you have a decision to make as the consumer to either advance your offset and commit it, or not, and just stop the stream and basically have an operator fix the problem. So it's a very different semantic.
Yeah, Kafka is built for data movement ultimately. And the way I see it is Kafka could totally be like a destination for a deck. But Kafka isn't really built to enable you to like process those individual messages in distinct ways with your own application logic. Kafka is really point A to point B and maybe point C. Move all the data as you can, the fastest you can, assuming there's going to be very little error. And if there is going to be error, you're probably just going to completely stop until that error is resolved, which is very different to how you want to build like actual application. Yeah.
Think of it as a kink in a hose, right? That's exactly what it is. Like you've got data flowing and it's flowing and it's fine until you have a kink in the hose, and then everything stops until you fix the kink.
Which is really not how you build applications, but that's how you might want to build your data streams.